Welcome, thank you for clicking through to this video on how a choke system works on both a 4-stroke and a 2-stroke carburetor. This is how the choking system works to the best of my knowledge and beliefs that I've gathered over the last 25 years plus, and the images you'll see are what I've made myself in Photoshop. So hopefully I can explain my point efficiently. Okay, so the pistons are at top dead centre and they're just about to lower onto the induction strokes, and what we'll see immediately is that as they lower they create a vacuum above them, and that draws in air into the engine through the carburetors. So there we can see now we've got air approaching the carburetor which wants to actually go through. But of course the air can get through because on each of those little butterflies on the choke there's a tiny hole which allows a very restricted amount of air to get through. And this air of course will be filtered air because it will have come through the air filter before it got to the carburetor, but it all continues down through the induction tube and it passes the restriction here in the venturi, and these restrictions will come into their own shortly, but at the moment they don't do a great lot, and so the air continues through towards the engine. And this restricted amount of air can pass the throttle butterflies well enough because usually the throttle butterflies are part way open when starting an engine. So off that air goes into the engine, but remember we've got no fuel in there yet, just a small amount of air. But of course the pistons lowering want to draw in as much of that air as they possibly can on their downward cycle. But because the choke is shut off and only so much air is allowed in, there builds up inside of the induction tube here a lot of vacuum pressure, and because that vacuum pressure can't draw any more air in from here, it goes to these areas here. It goes to the main jets to draw from. So if I just change the colour of these vacuum arrows where the vacuum's building up rather than have them yellow, we can see a little better. There we go. And so the purple arrows are representing where the vacuum's building up, and you can see there that the vacuum is pulling out of the main jets. And the pistons are continuing to lower then on the induction stroke, and what we see then is that the vacuum continues there, the pull, and it's actually drawing up. If we have a look here on the 4-stroke engine, the fuel here, it's actually drawing up that fuel up the main jet. And so to get that fuel to rise up the main jet there is quite a simple process in comparison to the 2-stroke that the 4-stroke uses, because all it needs is a downward cycle and induction stroke in order for all this to occur. And so we can see there how the piston gets the 4-stroke carburetor working. And if we have a look at the similarities between the two carbs now, we've got vacuum pressure in both building up here in the induction tubes, which is pulling out here in the main jets, again caused by the air restriction here of the choke butterfly. So that full downward stroke of the piston on the induction stroke is getting all of these areas working. On the 4-stroke here, as the air comes through and creates all that vacuum because of the restriction there caused by the choke, it's drawing again on the main jet here, and it's drawing that fuel that came up earlier. It's drawing that fuel outwards now, and it's all mixing in with the air, and it's all heading in towards the engine. Now one thing to note, and a testimony to how well the choke works to actually get the engine running, is that if we take a look there, we've got quite a low amount of air compared to a high amount of fuel coming through, as I've tried to show it. And of course we know that's because it draws on that jet quite strongly, because it can't draw all of that air that it wants to through the choke. And that's the only reason. And that's a good thing because we've got a lot of fuel going in there and in towards the engine to get the engine initially started. And at the same time, and in comparison then, let's have a look what's going on here in the 2-stroke. We'll see now that we've got the raising of that diaphragm has forced the fuel this way, and when it gets to the bottom of the needle valve here, it can actually pass through because the needle valve is lifted up off its seat and it's broke that seal. So there's a through road now, and the reason it's up off its seat is because we've got this metering diaphragm now being drawn down because of all of this vacuum here, which we know is very strong there, caused by the air restriction from the choke. And a nice collaboration's going on here between that vacuum pressure pulling out of the main jet and that positive pushing pressure of the fuel pump there, drawing that fuel this way and filling the metering area here, and then eventually coming out the main jet there, being drawn out and into the induction tube of the carburetor. But the situation with the 2-stroke is very much the same as the 4-stroke at the moment. We've got a high amount of fuel to air ratio, and that's of course, as we've said, because the choke butterfly's closed, which of course is dragging out on that jet there, so all that pressure is coming out of the jet, pulling the fuel out. And the situation both carburetors are in at the moment are that both have the carburetor butterflies closed still, restricting the air. Both have high amounts of vacuum in here, inside the induction tube. Both have a high amount of fuel coming out and going towards the engine, because both have a lot of that vacuum dragging out on the main jets here. And because both main jets are supplying fuel, fuel is being used from both of the stores on the carburetors here. And we know now that that storage area for the 4-stroke is like a reservoir of fuel there that we call the float chamber. And of course we've got the 2-stroke here, the equivalent, which is the metering area. But just to sum those areas up, in a nutshell, they're basically reservoirs to supply an amount of fuel up there ready for the main jets to use. As we know, so far we've had the choke butterfly closed, causing a restriction here of the air, making a greater vacuum inside there to draw out more fuel. And that, of course, is what we really needed to get the engine going from a cold start initially. But now we've got combustion occurring and the engine's warming up, we no longer need that high amount of fuel, because if we carry on using that amount of fuel, it will indeed be detrimental to the engine, because it will flood the engine with too much fuel, because a warmer engine doesn't need this amount of fuel. And of course, when we cold start an engine initially and we use the choke, we know that once it's fired we have to take the choke off. So here we'll show now that the butterfly's open. And all that restricted air now was drawn in through the carb and reduces that level of vacuum that was there when the restriction was there. That of course means that there isn't such a high amount of fuel being drawn out of the main jet now, and the air that's come into the inlet here has mixed well with the fuel. And the situation we're at with the 4-stroke here is similar to how it was with the 2-stroke on the last induction. What we've got here is that high amount of fuel still coming from here because we've got the choke still closed. And that means we've got all that vacuum in there drawing that fuel out the main jet. But what's happening now is that because the engine has actually undertaken a power stroke with combustion, so it started to combust the fuel, we're now going to open that butterfly there. So we're going to open that choke butterfly, and that will allow in an influx of all of that air that really wants to come into that inlet area there. And pretty much the same as the 2-stroke carb, this air all rushes in and fills all of this space inside the induction tube. But because we've got a certain amount of air coming through here and at high speed, it mixes with this fuel as it does with the 2-stroke, and it draws it all in towards the engine. It's actually the right amount of air to fuel mixture at this stage, as I said before. Any neat fuel going in there without any air mixed with it won't really combust as well, if at all. But of course what we do when the engine's taken hold, we open up the throttle butterflies, and that allows all of that air and fuel to come in much quicker and more efficiently, and that raises the RPM of the engine. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and if you think anybody else would benefit from this knowledge, then please do share and like. And also, if you want to know a little bit more about these carburetors, I've got a full version of how these carburetors work already on YouTube, so please check it out. Thank you very much.